April 26, 1947, Mount Yuatai, just outside the city of Nanjing, China. A truck rolled slowly up the hillside, surrounded by a crowd so large that people were running alongside it, just to keep up. Inside sat a Japanese general, once a powerful commander of thousands of soldiers, now so physically broken by fear that he could not even stand on his own. Two military police officers had to drag him out and hold him upright between them, because his legs had completely given out. Thousands of Chinese civilians lined the hillside, screaming, cursing, watching for one of the only moments of public justice this city would ever get for what had happened here a decade earlier. This is the story of Lieutenant General Hisao Tani, one of the men most directly responsible for one of the darkest chapters of the entire Second World War, and the brutal public reckoning that finally caught up with him. Hisao Tani was born on December 22, 1882, into a farming family in Okayama Prefecture, Japan. From an early age, his path pointed firmly toward a military career. He entered the Imperial Japanese Army Academy, graduating in 1903, 16th in his class, and went on to see combat as a young officer during the Russo-Japanese War. He continued climbing steadily through the ranks over the following decades, eventually graduating third in his class from the elite Army War College in 1912. A career trajectory that marked him, by every conventional military standard, as a rising star. By July 1937, as Japan plunged deeper into full-scale war with China, Tani commanded the Imperial Japanese Army's 6th Division. His forces fought through a series of brutal campaigns, first through the Beiping, Tianjin region, then through railway operations deeper into Chinese territory, then through the Battle of Shanghai, pushing steadily toward China's capital city, Nanjing. By December 1937, his division had joined two others in what would become known as the Battle of Nanking, and the assault that followed would lead directly into one of the single most horrifying atrocities of the entire war. What happened in Nanjing over the following weeks became known to the world as the Nanjing Massacre, or, as it's more widely known in the West, the Rape of Nanking. What actually happened inside that city is almost impossible to fully comprehend, even now, more than 80 years later. Japanese troops, including soldiers under Tani's direct command, are documented to have murdered an estimated 200,000 to 300,000 Chinese civilians and disarmed soldiers over a period of roughly 6 weeks. The official death toll engraved on the memorial wall in Nanjing today stands at 300,000. Mass executions were carried out along riverbanks and in open fields. Tens of thousands of women were raped, often in front of family members who were then murdered for trying to intervene. Soldiers reportedly competed with each other over kill counts, treating the slaughter of human beings as something closer to sport than warfare. Entire sections of the city were burned. The scale of what happened was so extreme that even decades later, the death toll remains disputed and debated by some. But the underlying horror of those 6 weeks has never been seriously questioned by mainstream historians. Tani's own forces were documented as being directly responsible for organizing and carrying out mass executions of prisoners of war and civilians during the assault on the city. After Nanjing fell, Tani was recalled to Japan and continued his military career, eventually being placed in the reserves by 1939. For years, it appeared he might simply slip away from the war with his role in what happened at Nanjing never fully accounted for. But Japan surrendered in 1945, and China had not forgotten. In 1946, the new nationalist Chinese government established the Nanjing War Crimes Tribunal specifically to prosecute Japanese officers responsible for the atrocities committed in their former capital. Of all the senior commanders who had been present during the assault on Nanjing, most had already escaped accountability entirely. Some had already died. One had been granted immunity because of his royal bloodline. One had taken his own life before the war even ended. Out of everyone who could have stood trial for the single worst massacre of the entire Sino-Japanese War, Hisao Tani was, remarkably, the only senior commander still alive and available to be brought before a court. The trial that followed was criticized even at the time as rushed and imperfect. Conducted nearly a decade after the events themselves, with witnesses and evidence scattered across a country that had spent those same years locked in a brutal civil war. Tani pleaded not guilty, attempting to shift blame onto a fellow commander and the troops who had served under him, claiming he had not personally ordered the worst of the atrocities. But the prosecution built its case around something almost impossible to argue against. An actual reel of film, reportedly showing Tani himself present at a mass execution site in China, combined with overwhelming eyewitness testimony from survivors. The evidence was considered conclusive. If you didn't know any of this history before this video, pause for a second and really sit with that number. 200,000 to 300,000 people. In 6 weeks. In one city. If this is the first time you're hearing the full scale of it, that's exactly the kind of history this channel exists to tell. And if you want more of it, this is a good moment to hit that like button. On February 6, 1947, the tribunal found him guilty. On March 10th, the court formally pronounced its sentence. Death for instigating, inspiring, and encouraging the men under his command to carry out general massacres of prisoners of war and civilians. Tani's legal team filed a desperate, last-minute appeal. It reached the desk of Chinese nationalist leader Chiang Kai-shek himself. Chiang personally rejected it on April 25, 1947, one single day before Tani was scheduled to die. What Tani did in those final hours reveals something about how he understood his own ending. Early on the morning of his execution, according to historical accounts, he carefully clipped his own fingernails and cut 3 small strands of his hair, placing them inside a pouch made from his handkerchief, intending for these small fragments of himself to eventually be carried back to Japan for burial, since his body would remain in China. Before he was taken to the execution ground, he wrote a short poem. Translated, it read roughly like this: "When the cherry blossoms bloom, it is when I will die. Painfully parting with my wife, who will lose her husband. Wishing, as my body turns to mud, China's hatred for Japan will cease." Then they came for him. On the morning of April 26, 1947, Tani was loaded onto a truck and driven through the streets of Nanjing toward Mount Yuwatai. The same ground where, a decade earlier, so many of the massacre's victims had been executed. Word had spread overnight. By the time the truck arrived, the hillside was packed with civilians, many of whom had run alongside the vehicle simply to make sure they did not miss the moment. One of the military policemen assigned to escort him that day, a man named Zhang Tao, gave a detailed account of what happened decades later in an interview given near the 60th anniversary of Japan's surrender. He described Tani as so overcome with terror that his entire body had gone limp. He could not stand on his own and had to be physically dragged from the truck and held upright between 2 officers just to walk him to the spot. He was not tied. No sign was placed on him identifying his crimes. According to Zhang Tao's own account, a squad leader simply raised a pistol behind Tani's head and fired a single shot. The bullet entered diagonally through the top of his skull and exited through his mouth, knocking out 2 of his front teeth in the process. He died instantly, collapsing to the ground. The crowd that had gathered on that hillside, according to multiple witnesses present that day, erupted into cheers and applause. One survivor of the Nanjing Massacre itself, a man named Yu Changxiang, who had lived through the very horrors Tani was being executed for, later described the scene with a single haunting line. He said it felt as though, finally, even the Japanese had this day, and that watching it happen felt like a weight had been lifted from the entire city. After the execution, local officials tied Tani's arms and legs, secured his body to a bamboo pole, and carried him away to be buried in what had once been ordinary vegetable fields nearby. A quiet, almost anonymous end for a man who had once commanded thousands of soldiers through one of the most documented atrocities of the entire war. Out of every senior officer present at the fall of Nanjing, out of every commander whose troops took part in 6 weeks that the world has never fully been able to comprehend, Hisao Tani was the only one who ever truly answered for it in a courtroom. Not because he was the most responsible, simply because, by the time anyone came looking, he was the only one still alive to find. If you want to hear what happened to the soldiers nicknamed for their kill count contest during the very same massacre, the men, whose names became forever tied to one of the cruelest competitions ever documented in modern warfare. That video is coming next. Subscribe to Ordinity so you don't miss it.